Hello, and welcome to your lesson on cell differentiation. So, we began the unit talking about the two different types of cells that ever existed on this earth, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. We dove deeper into the world of eukarya, and we compared different structures and adaptations in unicellular eukaryotes and multicellular eukaryotes. We then compared different structures found in different types of multicellular eukaryotic cells. Today, we're going to talk about how all of these cells became specialized or differentiated for their function. So at the end of this lesson, you will be able to explain how the instructions in our DNA lead to all of these different types of cells that have specific and special functions, especially in multicellular organisms. So your body is made up of many different types of specialized cells. Specialized cells are cells that have specific functions. So your fat cells, your brain cells, your heart cells, your red blood cells, and your nerve cells all have different special, unique functions. The process of them becoming special and unique is called differentiation. You have access to this presentation, so you are more than welcome to click on the link to learn a little bit more about differentiation. So again, specialized cells are cells that are found in multicellular organisms that have a particular adaptation to perform a special task. Remember, an adaptation is a feature or a technique or a tactic that an organism or organelle or cell may have in order to help it survive and reproduce. So here are some different specialized cells. We have nerve cells, we have muscle cells, we have red blood cells, white blood cells. And in the groups of white blood cells, there are many different kinds of white blood cells like monocytes, eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils, and lymphocytes. We actually saw neutrophils when we were talking about chemotaxis in unicellular organisms. So please go back and watch that if you have not already. But yes, specialized cells are cells that have specific particular functions in multicellular organisms. These specialized cells work together to actually perform specific functions. They're organized into tissues. Remember when we were talking about the characteristics of life and cell organization, that all living things are made of cells. It's one of our cell theories. And cells come together to make tissues. Tissues come together to make organs. Organs come together to make organ systems, and organ systems come together to make organisms. So at this basic level that we're looking at right here, our specialized cells that each perform specific functions can organize into tissues to perform a larger function for that organism, that multicellular organism. So here's some examples of some tissues. In animals, we have blood tissue, skin tissue, muscle tissue, bone tissue, and even in plants, as multicellular organisms, they have specialized cells too, like xylem and phloem and their epidermis. So the first kind of specialized animal cell we're going to talk about in multicellular organisms is called a nerve cell. This nerve cell is specialized to transmit signals. What's another word for transmit? Right, to send. So nerve cells are specialized to send signals. How do nerves send their signals? Well, each of these nerves is connected to each other by these long tendrils we call axon terminals. These axon terminals are connected to each other. The axon terminal from one cell is connected to the cell body of the other. And signals are sent through the cells and passed on that way. See, as the signal comes in at the top of the nerve cell, it moves through the body of the cell, moves through the myelin sheath of the cell, and exits at the axon terminals where it connects to another cell and sends the signals. Remember, these cells are cells inside of a eukaryotic organism. So what do you think this dense region right here is? What is the defining characteristic of a eukaryotic cell? What do you think these dense regions are inside a eukaryotic cell? What does "eu" mean in eukaryotic cell? Exactly. These are nuclei, so this is a nucleus. The next kind of specialized cell we're going to talk about is a sperm cell. A sperm cell is a specialized cell in a multicellular animal that is specialized for movement and transmitting or carrying genetic information. So it is specialized for movement and carrying genetic information. So the sperm cell needs a lot of mitochondria. Why do the sperm cell need a lot of mitochondria? What do they have to do? What is the function of a sperm cell? Exactly. Its function is to swim to the egg, which is the equivalent of like miles and miles of walking for us. So sperm need energy in order to swim the distance. The mitochondria can do that. So you already guessed it. The next kind of cells we're going to be talking about are red blood cells and white blood cells. Look at this picture of a blood vessel. Inside our blood vessels, we don't just have blood, we also have platelets and red blood and white blood cells. Our blood is made up of a mixture of components that help us to survive. So let's talk about some of these cells. Before we do that, let's look at these cells under an electron microscope. Reaching back, remember, microscopes help us to see living organisms up close. Typically, light microscopes are used. However, electron microscopes offer a more in-depth and detailed picture of cells. So look at this awesome picture taken by an electron microscope. Look at how detailed that is. This is a red blood cell. Look at that dip in there. It looks huge. It's actually not. Look at this white blood cell. Look at those. These are actually called cilia. White blood cells have cilia. What do cilia help organisms do? Think about that. And this is a platelet. So it kind of helps our blood clot. So the next kind of cell is a red blood cell. These red blood cells are specialized to carry oxygen. They have small shapes or dips in the center. And they have no nucleus. But Miss Washington, I thought you said that all eukaryotic cells have nuclei. Yes, when the red blood cell was developing, it did have a nucleus. That nucleus told it exactly what it needed to be. And in order for the red blood cell to carry the most oxygen, now that it knew what its job was, it got rid of the nucleus so it could have as much space as possible. So immature red blood cells do have nuclei. They're learning how to become who they need to be. But because the red blood cell is specialized for carrying as much oxygen as possible, it's specialized for that small shape and has that dip in the center. So it has to get rid of that nucleus so that it can have the most amount of space. White blood cells are involved with the immune system. They're specialized for fighting infection. White blood cells actually have a large nucleus, so they're actually the exact opposite of a red blood cell. Look at that large nucleus. Look at this large purple dense area. That's a nucleus. Look at this large purple dense area in this picture. That's a nucleus. So white blood cells help us to fight infection. They have cilia, which are these little hair-like structures that help them move. This is a picture of a white blood cell actually engulfing yeast. This process is actually called endocytosis. So the process of engulfing, especially a white blood cell engulfing yeast, is called endocytosis. Endo means inside. or in, and cyto means cell. So the white blood cell is taking the yeast into its cell, hence why the process is called endocytosis. Here are some other specialized cells that we have in our body. Our pancreas cells are specialized for making insulin. Remember, insulin is important because we need to control our blood sugar. If we don't have cells that are able to make insulin to help us break down sugar, our blood sugar gets too high and we get sugar buildup in tissues like our eyes and our toes, and we don't want that. Individuals who suffer from not making enough insulin suffer from what disease? Right, diabetes. Another kind of specialized cell is a muscle cell. Muscle cells are specialized to make ATP through a process called aerobic respiration. So if you listen to my Club Cell song, DJ Mitochondria in my ear, I've never seen so much respiration, meaning that the mitochondria was making, or the DJ was making so much music and was making everyone produce so much energy through this process called aerobic respiration. Muscle cells have a lot of mitochondria because they need a lot of energy. They help us move. So here's a muscle cell. Its specialized structure is to make ATP. Look at that nucleus. Of course, we're eukaryotic organisms, so we must have nuclei in our cells, right? Now, we talked about specialized cells in animal cells, in multicellular animals, but there are also specialized cells in multicellular plants. Plants have specialized cells like xylem and phloem. The xylem is a vessel that transports water up from the roots through the stem to the leaves, whereas the phloem transports sugars and nutrients down from the leaves through the stem to the roots. So as the xylem is pulling water up, the phloem is sending food down. The way I like to remember this is that phloem reminds me of food. Phloem moves the plant's food through the plant, and xylem moves the water. So how do cells become specialized? Well, all living things like humans begin as one fertilized cell. So all living things begin as one fertilized cell called a zygote. A zygote is formed when an egg and a sperm unite or come together. So how is it that you were one cell in your mom's belly? I was one cell in my mom's belly. Plants were initially one cell in the ground. But how is it that we went from being one cell to trillions of different kinds of cells? How did that one cell make all of this possible? What in the world did that one cell contain in order to orchestrate such a masterpiece, such as yourself? Well, the process of one cell becoming a multicellular organism with so many different specialized cells is called cell differentiation or cell specialization. It's the process of your cells becoming special to perform different functions. So all cells and living things contain the same DNA. That is the very first and most important part of this process. And what makes this possible, what makes us go or are able to go from one cell to multiple cells is that all of our cells have the same DNA. Since all of our cells came from one fertilized cell with one full copy of complete DNA, all of our cells have to have that same DNA. So the process of fertilization happens first. And then cell division happens. So that zygote then divides a little bit and makes more cells. This turns into an embryo. And then those cells then differentiate or specialize based on the function they need to carry out. and differentiate. So we must be fertilized, our cells must be fertilized, they must divide, and then they must differentiate. So the whole reason or how they become specialized and have all the same DNA is because we came from one single cell. That one single cell, that zygote, had all the instructions we needed for everything we are today. So cell differentiation is a result of actually taking these multiple cells, those differentiated cells that were unspecialized and didn't have a job, and giving them jobs. And we do that by expressing different genes. So let's talk about it. What are genes? What do you mean expressing different genes? So we know that we all have the same DNA, all of our cells have the same DNA. And we know that all of our cells came from one initial cell. And when those cells divided, they weren't specialized, but then they became specialized by expressing different genes. What does that even mean? What does that mean? Well, cells become specialized, or how they do that is because cells all have the same DNA, and your DNA is made of genes. Your DNA, all of your DNA is made up of different kinds of genes. And each of these genes are for specific proteins that result in different functions. And so these different genes are expressed in different types of specialized cells. So your DNA is made up of trillions, millions and trillions of different kinds of genes. Each of these genes codes for a protein that has a function in your body. So there's a protein to make your hair a certain color or texture. There's a protein to make your skin a certain texture or color. There's a protein to make fats in your body. There's a protein to make enzymes to break down certain things in your body. There are different proteins for different functions. And so your different genes are expressed when those different proteins are turned on. And when they're not turned on, then those proteins aren't expressed. Let me try to explain genes and DNA and proteins to you in a different way. I am going to share the whiteboard with you. This is the way I like to understand genes and DNA and proteins. Your DNA codes for all the proteins that your DNA codes for all the proteins that make everything you are. Codes for your proteins. Your DNA codes for your proteins. Think about your DNA, and it has genes that helps codes for those proteins. Think about your DNA as a paragraph. Think about your DNA as a paragraph. You can say that my name is Dom. I like blue. I love to run. I have a puppy. So let's say this paragraph is like my DNA. So a paragraph is like your DNA. Your paragraph is like your DNA. Your genes are pieces or sections of your DNA. So each of these sentences is like a gene. So your sentences are like your genes. Okay? So So notice each of these sentences are different, which means that these sentences have different meanings. Proteins have different functions and different meanings. So just like each of these sentences has a different meaning, so just like your sentences have different meanings, proteins, so just like your sentences have different meanings, different meaning means that your proteins have different functions, or your genes have different functions. Okay? Okay? So I'm going to say this again. Your DNA is made of genes, and your genes code for different proteins that have different functions. So just like this paragraph has sentences, the entire paragraph is like my DNA. The different sentences are my different genes. And my different sentences have different functions and they mean different things. So they code for different things. Just like proteins, or genes code for different proteins that have different functions. I like blue has a different function than my name is Dom. So cells become specialized when those different genes are expressed or turned on in those different cells. Those different cells make their specialized proteins and they result in different functions. So on your activity or on your follow-up questions, there's a question that asks, what do I compare specialized cell specialization to? What process do I compare specialization to? This is the process that I compare specialization to, or cell specialization to. This is the way I like to think about it. Think about it. The head chef wrote a cookbook of the recipes for his restaurant, which he gives to all his cooks who work for him. So the head chef of his restaurant has all these cooks, and he has this cookbook that he put all his recipes in, all his recipes for his meats, all his recipes for his soups, and all his recipes for his desserts. Now, all of his employees get the same cookbook. The entire cookbook. All of his employees get the same entire cookbook. They don't get special cookbooks right off the bat. They get the entire cookbook. However, the cook who prepares the meat, he only uses the meat recipes, so he stays in the meat part of the cookbook. The cook who prepares the soups only stays in the soup part of the cookbook, so he doesn't go to any other part but the soup part of the cookbook. And the pastry chef only uses the desserts recipes in the cookbook. So while all of them have the same cookbook, they read different parts of the cookbook in order to do their specific jobs. They may all work at the same hotel, at the same restaurant. They have the same cookbook, but they all have different jobs in that restaurant. Okay? So think about the head chef as your DNA, or the head chef as your nucleus. Your nucleus runs this restaurant. He runs this cell. He runs this show. And he gives DNA to each one of the different types of cells. So he may give DNA to a nurse. He gives DNA to different types of cells and tells them to go become specialized. So he gives DNA to his workers and tell his workers to go do their specific jobs. How do they know how to do that? Because they read specific parts of the DNA for them. Every other part that they didn't read was turned off. They didn't need, if he worked meat, he didn't need the soups or the dessert. So he didn't read that part of the cookbook. He didn't read that part of the DNA. So again, all cells have the same DNA, just like all cooks in this restaurant have the same cookbook. However, cells express different genes that allow them to perform their specialized function. Each of these cooks read specific parts of the cookbook to perform their special function and prepare their special part of the meal. Okay? So, all cells in your body contain the same DNA. This is the most important point. All cells in your body contain the same DNA. However, each cell type expresses the genes that are required for their particular function. All other genes that they have in their DNA are not expressed. Only the expression of the genes that they need to express. So while the skin cell and the muscle cell and the nerve cell all contain the same DNA, of course, in a particular organism, they all have different functions because they read different parts of the DNA. So then what are stem cells? How do we get to a nerve cell? How do they know what part of the DNA to read? Well, specialized cells actually come from undifferentiated cells called stem cells. So your nerve cells and your skin cells and your muscle cells all used to be unspecialized. It was when they read their parts of the DNA, it was when the chef gave them their cookbook that they started to read what they needed to. Stem cells have the capacity to differentiate into many different types of cells. That's why stem cells are so important. There are two kinds of stem cells. There are adult stem cells and there are embryonic stem cells. Adult stem cells are found in mature organisms and can develop into many types of cells. So adult stem cells, typically found in like bone marrow and things like that, can develop into nerve cells, muscle cells, skin cells, and many other kinds of cells. However, embryonic stem cells that are found in a developing in a mother's belly, a developing baby, they're found in those are embryos and they're found in the mother, and they're developing offspring that can develop into any kind of cell. So while adults, we can make many different kinds of cells, stem cells from embryos developing babies are the jackpot because they can develop into any kind of cell. So here are some things to think about. How are specialized cells different from undifferentiated cells? How are specialized cells created? Why do cells look different and have different functions if they contain the same DNA? And what are stem cells? Those are just some questions to be thinking about. Please make sure you answer my follow-up questions in my lesson 2.3 cell specialization comprehension question. Thank you and have a wonderful day.